All right, we'll give people one more minute to get signed in and set up. Looks like people are signing in. I'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the Oregon chapter of the American Planning Association's webinar, AICP Exam Prep Live Q&A. We're here to learn some tips and tricks about studying for and taking the AICP exam. Today's presentation is brought to you by the Professional Development Committee, or the PDC. The PDC is responsible for providing opportunities for continued education of OAPA members, as well as planners around the state and appointed officials, and to promote membership in OAPA and AICP. I am Lee Alligood. I'm the Professional Development Officer for the OAPA, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. I'll first provide some introductory information and how-tos about the webinar and the panelists, and then I'll moderate the Q&A session. There's a little bit of a lag. There we go. And this is what I just mentioned. The Professional Development Committee is a volunteer committee. We provide webinars every 2 to 3 months in addition to AICP exam prep items. And if you would like additional information, you can contact us at oapa@oregonapa.org. So we have a few upcoming events in the next couple of months that I want to tell you about. One is the OAPA Annual Planning Conference. That's in Eugene, Oregon, later this month, 24th to 25th of October. Another item hot off the press is an AICP exam prep trivia night. That's in the works. Our emerging planners group is putting that together. The date is to be determined, but it'll be before the November 4th testing window opens. A third event is the Legal Issues Workshop, which is in Portland on December 6th. And all of these items, the Planning Conference and the Legal Issues Workshop, provide continuing education, or rather certificate maintenance credits for AICP. We also are a member of the Ohio Webcast Consortium, which allows us to provide planning webcast series for free to our members. It's each Friday from 10 to 11:30 a.m. And you can see what the subjects are if you go to the link. We'll send this out after the event as well, so you have that information. And you can always find our events on OregonAPA.org events if you're interested in what's happening out there. So today I'll provide a little overview of how to ask questions of our panelists. I'll share our presenter bios, and then we'll move into the live Q&A session. We'll end the presentation at 12:55 to allow 5 minutes for wrap-up. And you should see a Q&A button at the top of your screen or potentially the bottom, and everyone can select that button now and a dialog box will pop up. And you can go ahead and type your question in that box when you have it. We're not using the raise hand or chat option today, so don't use those to answer or ask questions. And as I mentioned, we'll share the slides and the recording following this event. We also have a list of AICP exam prep materials that we recommend. So I'll provide some brief introductions of our presenters. We have 4 presenters today. They each passed the exam in May 2019. Jacob Ripper is a senior planner for the Deschutes County Community Development Department, where he has been for 3 years. Before moving to Bend, he worked as a planner for Jackson County in Southern Oregon. He graduated from the University of Oregon with a bachelor's degree in planning, public policy, and management, and went on to earn a master's degree in city design and urban cultures from the London Metropolitan University in London, England. Outside of work, he enjoys skiing, hiking, and camping, but most of all, he enjoys playing fetch with his wide-haired pointer, Corbin. Kyle Kearns is a planner too at the City of Medford, focused predominantly on long-range planning since 2016. A year prior, he served with the University of Oregon's Resource Assistance for Rural Environments, or RARE, program in Northwest Oregon, doing similar work for the Regional Solutions team. Having graduated from the University of Cincinnati's Urban Planning program, Kyle moved from Ohio with a comprehensive planning background from the Midwest. Kyle's time outside of the City of Medford is spent in the mountains or the ocean, seeking waves or snow. Mike Janusik is a land use planner at Dowell, a Pacific Northwest engineering firm. He focuses on finding land development solutions for private sector clients in Oregon and Washington. He is particularly interested in renewable energy development, trail planning, and Oregon's farmland protection program. Mike holds a bachelor's in economics from Loyola University Chicago and a master's in urban planning from UCLA. You can find him cross-country skiing at Mount Hood Meadows or Teacup during the winter. Tabitha Bachetti is a planner with the City of Tualatin, where she works on a small team to move development review and legislative projects. She has previous experience with the City of Portland, both with their land division and environmental review team, and working on the comprehensive plan update. She is a past graduate of the PSU MERC program. And thank you so much to all of you for being here today and sharing your experience with us. So again, if you have a question, use the Q&A feature to ask questions. You can submit questions at any time and we'll respond to them in the order that they come in. And we will go ahead and get started with the webinar. We are recording this, as I mentioned, and we'll share it on YouTube after the event, so you'll be able to refer to it again if you like. And if you have more questions after the webinar, you can contact me at pdo@oregonapa.org. And so I'm going to start with one question for our panelists, just to get us warmed up. What is the one piece of advice you wish you had when you were preparing to pass the exam? And let's start with Tabitha.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tabitha. So in terms of what I wish I knew then, but I know now, I feel like I started with like a fairly good sense of like, oh, I'm gonna want to study about maybe 8 hours a week, and I have a pretty long bus commute, so I thought I was gonna pack a lot of that studying into that time and that I'd structure my time in that way. When I started my studying process, I really found that the materials I had set myself up with and the time I had set myself up with did not sync up. In particular, I tried using APA's study guide, and a lot of that is very much based on streaming. I was able to download things onto my phone, but it was very clunky. And so I would say one thing I wish I had done more was making sure that the things I wanted to study with were compatible with the format that I wanted to study. And also I ended up in the end really just spending a long time just downloading a lot of those videos onto my phone so that I could study at my leisure when it was convenient for me. And so I kind of wish I had just done that all at once in the beginning and just one big chunk, maybe put on a bad movie and just set myself up for the months ahead.
Great. Michael, how about you?
I would say the one piece of advice I wish I had going into the whole process would be to simulate the testing environment as much as possible. I remember getting to the testing center and really being uncomfortable with the first 20 to 30 questions. And it's a subtle thing, but it can kind of throw your game off. It'd been at least 2 years since I'd taken a test, so it's very much performance-based, and you have to be you have to prime yourself to be comfortable in that environment. And I had done the majority of my test prep in my own apartment, pretty much, like a hermit in isolation. So it was great for focus, but then even though I was in that controlled testing center environment and it's quiet, there's still other people around you. So I'd say maybe try and go to a public library and run through 50 or 60 questions just to sort of be around other people. So if there's minor distractions, you're still focused on the task at hand.
Great, thank you. Jacob, how about you?
Yeah, I think my piece of advice is that you don't have to know everything on the exam, and you don't have to be an expert on every section of the exam. Kind of like being in the planning profession, you just need to know a little bit about a lot of things. So many of the questions are written in a way where if you're familiar with the topic or subject, you can make an informed guess. So don't let it worry you if you're guessing many of the answers, because often there's more than one correct answer. You just need to choose the most correct answer, so you may be guessing quite a bit. And I guess, yeah, my message is don't strive for perfection when you're studying. There's no grades to the exam. If you pass it, you pass it. And your results even come with a little disclaimer that says, don't compare your results to other people, because all the questions come from a pool of all these questions, and exams may vary in the level of difficulty slightly. So just focus on passing and you'll be fine.
Great. All right, Kyle, how about you? And Kyle, I can't hear you. All right, well, while we're figuring that one out, we can move on to the next question, and we'll come back to you, Kyle, and see if you have anything to add on that first one. We did get a question from the attendees. This question says, I'm thinking of taking the exam in May. How much prep time should I give myself? Let's start with you, Jacob.
I had a small study group, and I think we started meeting about 4 months ahead of the exam, just trying to plan out a study guide and course, and building in a few weeks of wiggle room too. I know people have been successful with less time, but that's what I did, and I was successful with 4 months.
Great. Tabitha?
I mean, 4 months ends up being that time between applying and test takings, but I would say that, well, I had 4 months. I'd say I really started in earnest probably more like 3 months after you get that letter that's like, you're in. Like, oh yeah, really gotta get going. But of course, like how your week looks, like, can you do more like 8 hours? Can you do more like 10 hours? Do you know all of your land use law already and you're just gonna breeze it? There's some wiggle room there.
Great. Kyle, should we give it a try? Oh, there we go.
Okay, all right. So we're on number 2?
Yes, although if you have something to add on number 1, please do.
Sure, I'll start with number 1. The one thing that I wished that I had done or known prior to taking the exam was to also stay up to speed on current planning issues. So reading some of the APA articles and things that they issue on current topics. I think that would have helped, and it helps with that breadth of knowledge that Jacob was hinting towards. But and then as far as whether or not I chose the right point in my career, I
you haven't gotten to that one yet.
Oh, sorry, you changed the numbers up on me. I
did. This is a question from the audience about taking the exam in May and how much prep time should they give.
Oh, yeah, no, that's perfect because I took it in May. So I was on like a month-long vacation, like right before the exam. I got back like mid-April. That's when I started. I think it just depends on who you are, though. Some people study for months, others for weeks. It's really up to you.
Great. Well, and Kyle gave us a preview of the next question we'd like to ask. And this is, do you think you chose the right point in your career to take the exam? Why or why not? And Jacob, I think I just missed you on that last one. Do you have anything to add?
On the last question, sorry, or the right point in the career?
Let's start with the right point in the career.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, I took the exam probably about a year after I was qualified for my experience in education. I did apply and I was accepted to take the exam, but I decided to wait until the next exam cycle, just because I had a feeling that I wouldn't have enough time to dedicate towards studying at that point in my life. And looking back, I'm really glad that I did wait, because it allowed me to dedicate a lot of time during those 4 months to study. But I guess if you've just been accepted to take the exam and you have time to study, there's no reason to delay it. I'll say the longer it's been since your education, the fuzzier some of the details get. For example, I haven't thought about statistics in a long time, and I definitely needed to brush up on those skills. So my advice is to take the exam as soon as you feel ready, but also don't wait too long. Don't put it off for too long.
Great, thank you. Tabitha?
Let's see. I mean, in terms of timing, I don't think that there is one right time. For me, I'm about 4 years out of grad school, maybe a little over the experience requirements, but then some of my past experience was kind of hard to categorize, like my position and what I was doing weren't perfectly in sync. So there was a little bit of worry earlier when I was thinking about applying. I think realistically for me, and I know other people are in this situation, the impetus for deciding to do this now was in part because I have an employer who encouraged me and was willing to pay for at least some of this process, whereas my previous employer, that wasn't part of what they could offer. And so I think that, definitely if you find yourself in that position, it might be the time.
Great, thank you. Michael.
For me, I'd always heard from supervisors and mentors to take it fresh out of school as soon as possible because you'll be rusty on material. And I actually I'd planned on taking it in fall of 2018, but APA had rounded my experience down a little bit, where by my calculations, I had 2 years even, and by theirs, I had 1.8 or 1.9. So I was kind of caught between scrambling to get cobbled together internship experience and get over that 2-year threshold, or really it was kind of an opportunity to kind of do a self-evaluation and assess whether I had whether this timing was good for me or not. And ultimately I decided to wait until the next cycle for 6 months because I was new to Portland and new to my job. And so I figured I was still adjusting. I'd have a little bit more balance in my life and I could study over the winter as opposed to the summer. And that was really the deciding factor. So it was kind of a blessing in disguise that I wasn't actually as qualified to take the exam as I thought I was.
Great, thank you. Kyle, your thoughts?
Yeah, so it kind of like I wrote down like a slight story. As whether or not there's a good time to take it. Well, my mom got her doctorate in her late 40s, so I don't really think there's a great time for anybody. It just depends on whether or not you want it. Everybody says it's easier to take tests when you're out of school, but I kind of disagree. It just depends on how hard you try. So I don't think there's any bad time. And much like Tabitha, the city of Medford has a differential. So my inspiration was, kind of twofold. So I just, talk to your employer and see if they're supportive. And if they're not, then, weigh the decision as to whether or not you have the time to do it. It's not a bad thing. Anyways, it definitely freshens you up on planning topics. So.
Great, thank you. Our next question. One of the more daunting aspects of the exam can be case law. What approaches did you take to studying case law for the exam? Let's start with Tabitha.
Oh, hey. So for case law, actually, I'd say early on in my studying process, didn't focus as much. I took a practice test about a month before the exam and realized, ooh, yeah, I need to double down on those cases. And what I actually found worked really well for me was just downloading a flashcard app. I went with Quizlet personally. There's a lot of existing AICP study materials that are on Quizlet and probably also other applications. And generally flip through those, and often when I'd find a case that I wasn't already familiar with, at least somewhat, then I'd go look that up and find a lot of more reputable sources like Cornell or the OIA's site has some really good summaries out there. And then I'd bug my partner and talk to him about some of the more esoteric land use cases. Did you know that this happened? To try to just really integrate it. And I'm a little worried that not as much of that stuck with me in the long term, but really cramming in some of that rote memorization in the last couple of weeks before the exam was super helpful.
Great, Michael?
For case law, what really worked for me was making a study guide. And it was really important that I made that study guide. I wasn't just reading someone else's study guide. For me, it was the process of making it that allows it to stick in your memory. So, and I can't remember where I heard of this tactic, but if you organize the cases by amendment, so you have a list of First Amendment cases, a list of Fifth Amendment cases, and a list of 14th Amendment cases. that will not only will you know a little bit about each case, but you'll know the legal principles behind it. And I think that was the most logical and the best way to do it. And then just make it a habit as you're going through materials, whether you're doing lessons or you're doing practice questions. Anytime you come across any case, just make a note of it on the side, and then later you can add it to that study guide. And organizing it by amendment was the best way for me.
Great, thanks. Jacob.
My study group helped a lot with case law. We used the APA's Exam Prep 3.0. I understand it's no longer available, but there's similar sources that can help. We ended up covering case law at the beginning of that course, and then throughout different segments of it as well. And then we were able to divide up a lot of our study material and then meet weekly and teach each other about what we had been studying. Also, there's a lot of case summaries from free online sources. I watched some videos on YouTube. I borrowed notes from a colleague from his personal work notes about case law that was relevant to work, that kind of thing. And then I found that making flashcards worked really well. I know that there are a lot that exist out there, but the act of just writing them out or typing them out helped me remember them. And the exam questions, they really don't go that deep into the subjects of the case. Mostly you just need to know the name of the cases, what it was about, one or two of the key takeaways, basically why it was important, and depending on the case, how it relates to other cases, other case law, or if it addressed certain constitutional amendments, that sort of thing. But you don't need to know the cases inside and out.
Great, thank you. Kyle.
So my method, I kind of just wrote down some of the big landmark cases. I would type them, then I'd write them, I'd type them, then I'd write them. That seems to be the way how I memorize. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I can remember them now, but they did retain enough to pass the exam. So if that's the quick and dirty method you want, I'd suggest that. But all the other methods, I wish I had known before. They sound pretty good too.
Yeah. Well, and this is probably a good time to mention that some of the materials we'll send out after this webinar includes some really great resources on case law as well. All right, and just a reminder, if you haven't already asked a question, you can use the Q&A feature. Just click the Q&A button on your screen. And if you do have a question, I'd encourage you to go ahead and submit it now, and we'll try to get through as many as we can during our time today. The next question for this group: how did you determine when you'd gotten deep enough into a topic to move on to the next? And this time, let's start with Kyle.
Usually about when I wanted a beer, to be honest. It was about when I decided I was done with that particular topic. I mean, I spent hours and hours studying because I felt like I had to crunch it in the 3 to 4 weeks I gave myself. So that was usually how I stopped studying.
You just got tired of it. Jacob, how about you?
I think the unfortunate truth is that you won't really know, at least with any certainty. But I used some practice exams. There's a website, planningprep.com. There's some others out there with free practice exams that you can take. And it'll break down your scores by the category. So, for example, I was getting higher scores on plan implementation and ethics, but lower scores in things like theory and law. And so just thinking about that not all subjects are equally represented in the exam questions, I tried to focus on those areas where I was struggling with getting lower scores and a combination of more questions on the exam.
Great. Tabitha?
Let's see. So I'd say in my original structure, I gave myself about 2 weeks for a topic, like the broad areas of the test. And at first, I think with history and theory in particular, it's really easy to go down the rabbit hole and you start languidly reflecting on, what your current workplace implements in terms of theory, really. And that's having those cutoff points was useful, just like you just have to move on. And then similar to Jacob, I found taking a practice test about a month before the exam really helpful, because that just highlighted where in those 2-week chunks, some things like particularly like the old guys and the key legislation and the law cases were for me really the ones of like, that's what I need to go back to. And so that was super helpful as well. I think I went with one of the state chapters, I want to say maybe Florida, had a good practice test.
Great. And we have 2 questions that one was answered. There's a question, what was the website for the practice study exams? And it's www.planningprep.com. And then a second question from one of the attendees is, what was your average amount of time to study per week? And I'll start with Tabitha again.
I think it was about 8 hours, so it's really variable in terms of like, did I zone out? Did spending an hour on the bus, like, is that like really an hour, or is that, it was quality time? I tried to break it up with like readings on the bus or at the gym, because I have a thing going on then, and then like maybe like 1 or 2 hours at home throughout my week, just kind of like slip it in where I could.
Great. Jacob.
Yeah, like Tabitha, is probably around 8 hours a week. I'd usually force myself to focus for most of a weekend day at home, just trying to get through the materials. Then I mentioned I was in a study group too. If you're not in a study group, I highly recommend forming one or joining one, because we were able to split up a lot of the recommended readings and the PAS reports and all the materials you're supposed to go through. But we would split those up each week, make notes as we went, and then meet for about an hour or 2 hours in the evening after work during the week, and essentially teach each other what we learned about the materials and readings. And then we kept study notes as well. So towards the end, when you're cramming, getting ready for the test, you can pull up those notes, and they were really helpful. So 8 hours on my own, maybe another 1 or 2 with the group per week.
Great. Kyle, was that your experience?
I think I did a little more because I was crunching it into maybe a shorter period of time. I also am fortunate to get every other Friday off work. So I would take those Fridays in my time and I would devote the full work day to studying. So it varied from week to week. I'd probably put mine closer to 10 hours, but it seems like I crammed it in a shorter period of time than others.
Great. And Michael, what was your average amount of time to study per week?
Ooh, sorry, I just lost connection, so yeah, I'm live again. I was tracking my hours. I think all told, I heard that I took a prep class and they said you should take at least 60 to 100 hours of prep time. I think I got on the lower end of that range, and I studied for 2 months. So I would say 10 hours, 15 hours a week.
And I would say a couple of you mentioned study groups, and I'll just mention that we did put together a list of interested people who are wanting to form study groups and sent it out probably about a month ago. But if you were not on that list and would now like to be on that list, let me know. Contact me at pdo@oregonapa.org and I'll include you. So we have another question from the attendees. Do you need the law specific to the state in which you're taking an exam? And Michael, I'll start with you again.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? Do you need
Sure.
the law specific to the state
In which you're taking an exam?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Sure. Well, I can start with this one actually. So the question is about, do you need to understand your specific state laws around land use? Different states have different requirements. Or if it's more more Supreme Court decisions that apply nationally, and I would say generally it's the Supreme Court decision, but I'd like to hear if you guys have any other input into that.
Yeah, I can talk to that. Yeah, as you said, Lee, it's they're 98% focused at Supreme Court cases or cases of national significance. There are a few cases from state Supreme Courts, but there's just a few, and they're still nationally significant because they kind of had a domino effect of affecting other state laws. But to answer the question, no, you don't need to know anything specific just to your state.
Great. Anyone else want to add to that one?
I'll add. I just think kind of the trend that even the nation follows sometimes is maybe even some California policy or law is helpful. Just, but I don't know how. It's just going to depend on your test, really. So use that with a grain of salt, maybe.
Great, good. All right, here's a question for you all. What areas, if any, did you encounter where the correct answer countered your personal experience as a planner? Does anyone want to start that off? All right, I'm going to pick then. Tabitha.
I mean, the tricky thing with the actual AICP exam is that you don't find out specifically which questions you got wrong or what the answers should have been. So of course, while there's one or two in my head where, like one I remember in particular was a question geared toward community participation. And it asks you, you're about to go partake in this participation process, which of the following things should you do? And one of the options was to engage established groups. And it was unclear, like, do you mean an established group like a neighborhood association that might be majority white, or do you mean an established group that might be culturally specific? And this question was getting at, how do you have a culturally specific community engagement process? So this was kind of ambiguous. So there are things like that where there's some inferences that are clearly coming from a perspective that aren't totally thought out necessarily. I would say on the practice exams, I was more worried about, what is the mainstream way of thinking and what is other ways of thinking and how are those going to clash on the exam. And I think I ended up going with the tact of just choose the one that you think you want to choose. And if a few end up going by the wayside because of that, it's still going to work out. At least it worked out that way on the practice exams, and it worked out that way on the real exam. So I'd say trust your gut.
Great. Jacob, thoughts?
I can't really remember anything specifically. Maybe there were some questions about like parking or trip generation or something like that. So like parking calculations may be different for you depending on your local code and what kind of jurisdiction you work in. Same goes for the classification of roads. You may have a TSP that uses different terminology for classifying roads. So I thought those type of questions were interesting because they were specific and number based, but I think looking back on it, those questions were really reasoning questions because it's giving you multiple choices and you're having to kind of infer the impacts from these different types of uses and then make an informed guess that way. So yeah, those kind of things I wouldn't rely on your local code knowledge for.
Kyle, any thoughts about that?
Just because, yeah, I mean, I guess if you read and study up on ethics and then make a decision that's completely counter to that, it doesn't make you an unethical planner. It just means you would have gotten the question wrong on the exam. So I just kind of didn't worry about it too much.
Great. Michael, anything to add?
There was one really tricky question about the definition of a PUD, and it had, in the definition it had that it was an overlay zone, which I didn't think was always the default correct answer, but I know for instance in Hillsborough it is an overlay zone. So, but that's a very specific example. I'd say generally speaking, just approach the questions through the lens of a mainstream nationwide planner. Or being an Oregon planner, there's a lot of idiosyncrasies to this market, and that'll give you an advantage when you're taking the test because you'll have been exposed to a lot of complex planning issues, but don't outsmart yourself when you're looking at a question. Don't necessarily apply the Oregon lens in every instance.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think it's something that Oregon planners maybe face a little more than others, is we have such a specific framework that we work within in the state. And so it's tempting to put these questions through that lens. And really what you're looking for, like Michael said, and the others is, what would the platonic planner do in this situation if you didn't have Metro, if you didn't have statewide planning goals, and just kind of, try not to overthink it, I guess. All right, you have all touched a bit on this earlier in this conversation, but there are a lot of study materials out there. How did you decide which materials to use and which worked the best for you? And you've mentioned practice exams and flashcards. Is there anything that you'd like to add to those tools? I'll start with you, Tabitha.
Let's see. I built off of the APA exam prep 3.0. I understand that it's not available, and there's a lot of things I really disliked about it. I don't actually think I made the right choice on that particular thing. Just the way that it's laid out was just a jumble of resources, like 200-page documents next to 2-minute videos, and you can't tell which is which until you get into it. I think from there out, there's a lot of just kind of Googling different online resources. Again, I liked that Quizlet. It felt very silly. That's not usually the kind of thing I defer to, but I really ended up loving it. So that's actually my number one resource tip for it. I have nothing better.
Thanks. Let's go to Kyle.
So one book I would highly recommend, and I have to give credit to a college professor on this one. It was Planning Theory for Practitioners by Michael Brooks. I remember so often he'd say in the class, if you're going to take the AICP exam, this is the one book you need to read for ethics. And I would just echo that, because it really goes into different bureaucratic structures and different systems and types of decision making, and it really helps you kind of think about all the different intricacies of what we go through as far as planning decision making. So I would really strongly encourage that. It's 150 pages. Each chapter is maybe 15 pages at best. So definitely read that book. Again, Planning Theory for Practitioners by Michael Brooks. I think it's on the recommended reading list even. So.
Thank you. Jacob, do you have any recommendations?
I used the online exam prep 3.0 as well. I had some gripes and complaints about it too. But it was good to have as at least an outline of what to study, and then we'd bring in other materials to supplement that. Our planning department was nice enough to purchase this book, Local Planning, Contemporary Principles and Practice. It's a textbook, and it has just little blurbs about different topics, but it was a great resource. And then, like I mentioned before, our study group, we would divide readings, make detailed study notes as we went, share those in the Google Drive, and that was probably my best go-to resource once it was getting close to exam time and I was really having to do reviews of things that we had studied 2 months ago and I may have forgot a little bit. So that was my number one resource, really.
Great. Michael, any great resources to recommend?
The Planning Advisory Service on APA's website, they have memos and reports, and I found that when I was repeatedly getting questions wrong on a certain topic, I dug up a couple of those PAS memos, and I think municipal finance was giving me some trouble, and I was consistently getting those questions wrong on practice exams. So I read a couple PAS memos, and I think that really just clarified those concepts, and then I improved my scores from there.
Great. And just a reminder, if you have any questions, now is a great time to pose them to our panelists using the Q&A feature on your screen. All right, next up, what was your day of strategy for the exam, and what tips do you have for exam takers? Let's start with Jacob.
Sure. I mean, some obvious things: get a good night's sleep, get there early, take the day off from work so you're not stressed about other things besides the exam. I remember from a webinar or something I read, there was some advice to visit the exam site before your test day. And I'd recommend that, even if you can't get into the building and see what the room looks like. It can help settle some unnecessary nervous feelings you may be getting about like how to get there, where to park your bike or your car, where the front door is, that sort of thing. And then I'd say build in some time towards the end of the exam to go back and recheck your answers, because you can flag questions that you're unsure about and you can come back to those. And so I flagged quite a few that I wasn't sure about, and actually some of the questions later in the exam either gave me a clue to the correct answer or at least jogged my memory. So I saved about 30 minutes towards the end of the exam, and I did end up changing several of my answers.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know if I changed them to correct answers or not, but I was glad to have the chance to do that.
Michael, any tips?
Yeah, I agree with pretty much everything Jacob said. Just make an effort to do a dry run with the test center so you're familiar with the surroundings and the protocol of getting there, where to park, how to check in and things like that. And I think all that can just be, any of those little hiccups could be avoided if you get there early too. Eat a breakfast, get a good night's sleep, feel relaxed. Also test out the software, the I forget the name of the software, but there's some demos you can try online. That way you kind of get a feel for the multiple choice setup. Yeah, that's about it. It'd be like if you had, I did sports most of my life, so it's just like it's a race or a game. You have to sort of get in that mindset.
Great. Kyle, any tips or tricks for the day of?
I don't really get nervous about tests, so if you're like me, then it was pretty easy to not worry about. I fortunately was able to use work time to take it, so kind of counter to the other point, it wasn't a big deal to me because I didn't set up meetings for after. So I definitely would echo don't have stressful things for after, but I didn't really think too much about it. I was also familiar with the place, so maybe that helped, but I just don't worry. That's my motto, I guess.
All right, Tabitha, anything to add?
I mean, I also really enjoyed the flagging feature as well. So yes, on that. I'd say one thing I did notice is that you really can't bring much of anything at all into the test room, but they will let you set up a couple key items with the staff, or at least, I mean, that was their policy a couple months ago. And so I really enjoyed giving myself some relaxation by taking a quick break, having my water, knowing my asthma inhaler was there. If somebody had some rank perfume in the space, that's a security thing and a human breathing thing. And so taking that time, because the test is, you have a pretty long time to take that exam. So giving yourself some permission to really take care of yourself and take the time more than you need would be what I impart.
Great. Here's a question about the actual testing itself. Are calculators allowed or provided? Does anyone want to take that one?
Yes, they're there.
They're provided. Mm-hmm.
They're on the computer, right? You have to click the numbers with the mouse.
It was built in.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we took care of that one. Okay, here is another question for you all. What did you find to be the most surprising thing about the exam? And I'll take a volunteer to start this one.
I'll volunteer. So kind of the reason why one of the things I advised, like I wish I had known before, was to study up on current issues, is I was actually surprised at how many current issues were on the exam. And they could have been, because like 20 or 30 of the questions are testing questions to see if they'll make it to the exam themselves. But, you know, you don't know that, so you still have to try your best to get it right. So I was surprised by that.
All right. Michael, do you have something to add?
Biggest surprises? That's big? That's a question, right?
Yep.
I don't know. Nothing was super. I guess there are probably a couple topics that maybe a couple questions that surprised me. Just make sure you have like the stamina to do 170 questions. So that's why you do the practice exams. And I would recommend doing at least one full length practice exam, maybe a week before. Don't do it the day before. Don't tire yourself out. Yeah, I think the practice exams I took were more detailed, and when I got there, I was a little surprised that the exam questions themselves were a little more straightforward, and so that was a pleasant surprise.
Great. Jacob or Tabitha, anything to add? Tabitha.
Yeah, I'd say likewise, I was pleasantly surprised. You know, like my last practice test, you know, it passed, but like not a margin that I was personally super comfortable with. Whereas like when I was about to hit that test score thing, I'm like, oh yeah, this is gonna be fine. So like, I don't know if that helps you like get pumped up a little bit, but yeah, I found like I was surprised by that feeling of reassurance. And as another smaller thing, and I was almost like surprised that I was surprised, but there was a question, at least in my set, about how an employer should respond if one of their reports comes to them talking about sexual harassment. And I was like, ooh, I didn't have that in my study materials, but yes, I am glad this is on our test. And so like those kind of like bringing in, you know, the reality of the world that we live in. I was like,
Great.
oh, yeah.
Jacob, any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I didn't have a lot of surprises. I guess it's a 4-hour testing window, and it can be surprising how quickly a few hours can pass before you really realize it. So just keep track of your time, trying to keep progress through the exam. Answer all the questions. You're not penalized for guessing. So, you know, if you're just really throwing a question out there, use that flag tool and you can come back to it later.
Right. So the next question is probably a burning one for many of our test takers. How did you work with your employer to help cover the cost of the exam? Was it contingent on your passing, and did they help you with the purchase of study materials? And I'll start with Tabitha.
Let's see. So in my case, my manager was the one who initially brought up to me, actually, if I wanted to go after AICP certification. Like, would help us put together our training budget. And so in that case, I was fortunate in many ways to kind of not be initiating that conversation. That said, I still need to work on my self-advocacy personally, and I'm sure I'm probably not alone in that. And so I think there were times when I would like initially be like, oh, should I pay for this or should I not? And so, I mean, it's dorky, but I think a strategy that helps me is kind of printing out all of the costs that there are, like your ongoing membership, everything else, and just kind of using those kind of printed numbers as the part at which you begin your discussion of what are the realms of possibilities with these numbers.
And so did your employer end up covering?
Oh, what did we end up covering? I think mainly we ended up covering the APA and OAPA membership, which is more ongoing. we did develop the exam registration fees. I think we ended up doing the test afterward. I don't remember the details, sorry.
Thank you. Jacob, how did your employer treat this?
Yeah, well, so nobody in my workplace had taken the AICP exam in a while, so to plant the seed in my manager's mind, during my annual review, I put it as one of my goals that I wanted to do in the upcoming year. So that started the conversation, at least. And then I was really fortunate, like I mentioned before, we had a books and materials budget. It's a pretty small budget, but it covered the cost of 2 textbooks. And there's some other planners in my office thinking about taking the AICP soon. So those are now property of the department and they can be used in the future. And then my work paid for my membership, my ongoing membership dues, and the application fee, which is the smaller fee. And then I was responsible for covering the cost of the exam registration fee, which is the larger fee. And that put a lot of pressure on me to pass the exam on my first attempt, but I guess that wasn't necessarily a bad thing.
Great. Kyle.
So we're pretty fortunate that our union was able to negotiate the differential for AICP for an increase in pay. So I'd encourage that. If you don't have that, definitely go down that route. And then we have a pretty supportive management when it comes to like continuing education, and we actually have a budget for conferences and things like that. And all of us who want to be a part of OAPA, or our dues are paid. So we have a pretty supportive management. So it wasn't a hard conversation for me. So I don't have much advice if you don't have that, because I didn't have to have those hard conversations.
Great. Michael.
Yeah, I'm fortunate enough that my company supports professional memberships, and when I interviewed for the position, it was one of my selling points that I was working towards the AICP certification, and I would soon be eligible to take the exam. So yeah, I think just echoing the previous points, it's sort of coaxing the powers that be to you self-advocate and you plant the seed, and then they can return with support.
Great. Yeah, and I don't know if there's a difference between private sector and public sector organizations. I know both that I've worked for have covered that cost of both the test and the membership, but it's a great benefit to talk to your employer about if it's not something they currently have on their radar. All right. So we have just a couple minutes left here, so I'm just going to ask you all to share your parting thoughts and final words of encouragement for test takers next month or even in May. And let's start with Tabitha.
Let's see. I guess I have like generic encouragement. I guess the one other thing that I had in my list, I guess one is that there is that trivia event coming up. I went to one of those before the cycle in which I ended up applying to take the exam, just to kind of get the sense of like, do I really want to do it? Because in all honesty, like I'm a person who is sometimes a little bit maybe skeptical of the whole professional certification thing. Does that really make you a better planner? I love the AICP Code of Ethics, but I don't like memorizing facts about Daniel Burnham. But I think for me, in the end, the studying process was a really good time to reflect, even if often I was doing boring rote memorization. There's still kind of other things that are going to be kicking around in your head during that process that you can make it meaningful for yourself. And going to things like the trivia event are also fun and a great place to reflect if you're also in that space of uncertainty as to whether AICP is something you want in your life at this particular juncture. So go ahead.
All right, thanks for the plug as well.
Yeah, it's been mentioned before, but it's a national test. So remember that the the writers of these questions, they don't know your code, they don't know your experience, they don't know the Oregon land use system. I mean, they may, but it's not directed towards that. So when you're considering your answers, just think broadly and ask yourself if the answer you're choosing answers the question as APA is asking it. And yeah, this is a stressful and rigorous process you're going through, so you should all be proud of yourselves. But if you put the time in, you'll do just fine.
Great. And Kyle?
Just self-care. You know, you're going to function better if you're eating well, sleeping well, working out, whatever you do to maintain that. Don't let studying get in the way of that as well. Great,
thank you. And it looks like we lost Michael, but I will pass along any words he might have after the fact. So that concludes today's OAPA AICP exam prep webinar. Thank you so much to Jacob and Kyle and Tabitha and Michael for sharing your insights with us today and spending your lunchtime with us as well. And I think we have a lot of good takeaways from this webinar, and we'll share it with everyone else. So a few follow-up items: an evaluation form will be sent to registered attendees within the next few days. In the same email, we will provide a PDF copies of today's slides and a link to the recording of the webinar, which will be on YouTube, and contact information for our presenters, along with a list of some study guides and resources that we've put together for you. Thank you so much for spending your lunchtime with us, and we hope you'll join some of our upcoming webinars and other events this year. Please check our OAPA website under events for upcoming webinars presented by the PDC and other offerings from this group as well. Have a great afternoon.